Hey everyone, welcome to the preservative section of this eSummit. My name is Sabrina Behnke and I'm an Associate Business Director of Biopolymers and Modern Preservatives at Trike Industries, and we're based out of New Jersey. I am a microbiologist and I've worked with disinfectants, biocides in the household industry, and with preservatives and other antimicrobial ingredients in the personal care industry. I guess it's safe to say that killing bugs has been a passion of mine for quite some time. For that reason, I'm excited to present this short lecture on preservatives to you today. Thank you also to Jen for inviting me to share my knowledge and speak to you today. Preservatives. I think they're one of the most misunderstood and feared ingredients, but actually very crucial to every good formula. I will argue that it really doesn't matter what else you put into your formula if you don't have a solid system to protect the formula. The screenshot that you see on the slide right now here is from 2018, and it was an article on the Credo website that I found very well written. The author describes how preservatives are very misunderstood and feared, and where this might be coming from. The quote you can see here is one of my favorite quotes. It says, "The ingredients people love to hate, but would actually hate not to have." Fear of preservatives, FOP, she calls it. Where could it be coming from? The author speaks about parabens. We know how much bad press they've gotten in the last 20 or so years, so I won't elaborate on that. The second reason being healthy eating, right? We all want to eat healthy, and foods with preservatives are often highly processed, and they therefore seem nutritionally inferior to, fresh foods, and so forth. So I would say unless we're willing to store our personal care products in a fridge and use them up within a week, we better get used to the idea of preservatives. It seems no matter how much scientific education is happening, fear mongering is lucrative in the media. I'm always disappointed when I see articles like this one here on the slide because I know how much work and scrutiny goes into finding the right raw materials for formulations and how diligent companies are in selecting safe and effective ingredients. It really gets more difficult as newspapers and blogs publish articles such as the one here, making consumers feel like the beauty industry literally is trying to poison them. Look at the selection of the imagery here. Very interesting. I mean, I've seen many recalls over the years for different odd reasons, but yet I have to still see a recall due to radioactivity in a product. The essential thing for preservatives is they are supposed to keep formulation stable over the course of the shelf life, and they're supposed to keep the product safe while they're in the consumer hands. I don't care how strongly you feel against preservatives, nobody wants to open their jar of face cream and find that it is completely moldy. Let's take a step back and look at why preservatives are needed in formulations. Most personal care products contain some amount of water which organisms need for growth. And then they contain additional ingredients that make excellent food sources for organisms. Think about the proteins that we like for our hair products, the peptides that we like in our skincare regimen, the natural extracts, or even prebiotic ingredients that are literally designed to be food for the skin microbiome. They all make really great snack options for bacteria. There are two ways that microorganisms can enter the product. Number one, during the production process, and then in the hands of the consumer. And the preservative system is supposed to manage both scenarios. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can use the water from your koi pond in the backyard to make your products. You should really aim to work with raw materials that have a very, very low microbial load. Some of the organisms that show up in recalls are organisms that come from your skin, such as Staphylococcus aureus. Others may come from food sources during production or even in your bathroom. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Burkholderia are the typical guys. And then fecal bacteria, E. coli, Klebsiella, Serratia, you might know also from your bathroom when you get this pink stain around your sink or on your shower curtain, that is most likely Serratia. Now, the FDA doesn't want your products to be completely sterile, but they really should be low in terms of microbial load. Since the days of the paraben panic, things have changed a lot for formulators. In the old days, you were able to formulate your product, you add a small amount of a broad spectrum preservative at the end of your formulation process, and you're done. Preservation really was an afterthought since there were so many potent preservatives available. They had really good pH flexibility, very few incompatibilities, they were easy to work with, and most of all, low cost. And the palette of preservatives that seems acceptable and less controversial by the wider public has been shrinking and continues to be shrinking, sometimes for scientific and sometimes for not so scientific reasons. Now we're working with materials that have limitations in terms of pH or compatibility. They're often not broad spectrum anymore, so you really have to select a few different options, find different combinations that give you that broad spectrum performance. And of course, they're overall a bit more expensive. So you really need to find somebody with formulation expertise, and this person has to really consider the preservative system right in the planning stages of the formula. This here is a great global overview of where we stand with different molecules in terms of popularity. What you're looking at here is Mintel data on launches, personal care launches in 2023. And again, this is a global picture. The x-axis shows you the compounded annual growth rate, or CAGR, over the last 5 years for each ingredient, and the y-axis shows you the number of launches we saw just in 2023. And what you can see here is that certain molecules such as benzyl alcohol, phenoxyethanol, they don't have a high growth rate anymore. They're maybe still growing a bit, but they're kind of established. Very popular, of course. You can see the bubble size shows you how many launches. Organic acids are still growing, very popular. They're used in a lot of products. I summarized them all into one bubble here. And then you see on the left side is everything that is more controversial or banned or restricted for some reason. Here's your formaldehyde donors, your parabens, your triclosan, triclocarbon. So all negative growth rates, meaning that their use is declining in the market. On the right side, you see some other molecules that are not technically registered preservatives. So you see things like ethylhexylglycerin, caprylyl glycol, pentylene glycol, chlorphenicin, and so forth. So these materials are technically called multifunctional ingredients or preservative boosters. So when I speak about preservatives and boosters or multifunctionals, what do I mean by that and what are the differences? We need to take a look at the European Cosmetics Regulation for this. There is an annex called Annex 5, and it has about 52 or 53 ingredients on it currently that are registered preservatives in Europe. So these registered preservatives, they have a maximum use concentration that is dictated. They may have other restrictions such as limited use or no use and aerosols, different concentrations for rinse-offs versus leave-ons, and so forth. So the Annex 5 will pretty much tell you what you can and can't do. And Europe sort of takes a leader function in this area, where other countries often look at what Europe does and follow this. It's not always the case, but it often happens. And these so-called boosters or multifunctionals, they're not on Annex 5. They're not registered preservatives when you look at them from a regulatory perspective. The goal is here that they have a primary function that is not the antimicrobial activity. So that could be, for example, they could be emollients, they could be moisturizers, antioxidants, and then their secondary function is the antimicrobial function. Now, in reality, you might use these ingredients only because they have an antimicrobial effect, but from a regulatory perspective, they have a different primary function. Now let's take a look at some of these molecules that are registered preservatives and that are boosters, just to give you an idea. In terms of registered preservatives, you see here benzyl alcohol, phenoxyethanol, chlorphenicin, things like organic acids, benzoic acid, dehydroacetic acid. So you see what these molecules look like, and then the so-called boosters at the bottom: caprylglycol, hexanediol, F-lexoglycerin, glycerol caprylate, hydroxycetophenone, caprylhydroxamic acid. And what I'm noticing here is, these multifunctionals or boosters often have these long chains. They're looking more like surfactants, I would say. But this is not a rule. This is just an observation. Here are some more exotic registered preservatives. You find Simon 5-ol. It's related to thymol. It does smell a little bit less like pizza, but it still has that signature scent. There's a newer molecule on the right side that was recently added to the Annex 5. It's called Hep B. And then there are other boosters at the bottom that are a little bit more exotic. Raspberry ketone, for example, pianesic acid, levulinic acid, or tropolone. Now we have a good overview of some of the available molecules out there. So how do you go about selecting the right option for you? When a customer approaches me for a preservative recommendation, I usually ask a variety of questions around the requirements to really gauge which options will work for them. Cost will align with the brand and pricing strategy, while more premium brands may not worry about the price tag as much, while others have restrictions. The preservatives, traditional preservatives, were used at low percentages in the past. They had a very high potency. Now the ingredients are maybe a bit milder and you need to use more, and they're also more costly. Solubility profile. Water solubility is often a factor. Water solubility can be good, just in the case of aromatic alcohols, organic acids. Other ingredients may need to be pre-solubilized in a specific glycol or in cosmetic esters, for example. Another thing you want to consider is your formula cold processable? Do you not want to use any heat? Then a liquid blend that is water soluble might be the right option for you. Other molecules may have to be melted or heated up to go into your formulation. Then also related to solubility profile is the affinity to the oil versus the water phase in emulsions. You will mix in your preservative, and some molecules will then travel to the oil phase of your formula, even if it's just micro droplets and not necessarily a two-phase system. And then traveling to the oil phase will allow organisms to grow in the water phase where less of the preservative is available. That's why it's important to run a preservative efficacy check after a certain stability period to see if the preservative is still available in the water phase and keeping your water clean. pH range is a big factor, obviously. The traditional preservatives were very effective at a broad pH range, and now we have some limitations here. It's a bit wider for aromatic alcohols. We have some flexibility there, but when you're, for example, working with organic acids, those sometimes need to be used at pHs of under 6.5 or even 5.5, depending on the specific organic acid. And then the efficacy range can be different from molecule to molecule. So some molecules are really good against bacteria. Fewer work well against yeast and mold. So you may need to combine two different types of preservatives or boosters to get that broad spectrum efficacy. Yeah, most non-controversial or less controversial preservatives are more effective against bacteria. So a lot of the modern formulations often struggle against yeast and mold. That's something to look out for. Which other factors are there? Odor is a factor. There's some molecules that have very distinct odors. It might work for your formulation, but it might also not work at all with the fragrance that you want, or in case you don't want any fragrance at all. Another one is viscosity modification. Certain molecules can cause a drop in viscosity. So always try to observe your viscosity as you go ahead and add your preservative or your booster to your formulation. There can also be discolorations. We see that sometimes with organic acid. Dehydroacetic acid is a candidate for that. And other natural materials can react with your preservative system and cause some discoloration. And then also regulatory perspective. Is the preservative registered or allowed in the countries that are of interest to you? Are you looking for just a US product, or are you looking for a globally compliant product? There could be a difference there. And naturality is also very important to a lot of formulators. And then what does naturality mean for your brand, for your company? Are you following the Natural Origin Index via ISO 16128? Or are you looking to achieve maybe a Cosmos certification, EcoCert certification, where you want an where it doesn't always have to be an NOI of 1. Some synthetic materials are allowed. And then another option is nature identical. So these materials are exactly the same as molecules that you would find in nature, but they're not derived from nature. So they can be fully synthetic, but it also has a naturality aspect to it. So now you have an idea of what the molecules that are out there. Some are more desirable than others. And why do we have all these different molecules? Well, they all affect cells a little bit differently. So you look at a structure of a bacterial cell here. These molecules may affect, the DNA replication, or they may have an influence on the protein synthesis. Or the enzyme activity. Quite common is actually the effect on the cell membrane. So that means the molecules will destabilize the cell membranes of microorganisms. The molecules with a more surfactant-like structure and a long tail. Think about the multifunctional ingredients that I showed you earlier. They can insert themselves into the membrane and weaken the membrane. And there is the advantage when you use two different types of molecules for preservation. One may weaken the cell membrane, and then the other one can enter the cell more easily, overall possibly limiting the amounts of preservatives that you need. And that can be considered a synergistic effect. I also wanted to make a brief mention of preservative tests because it's good to understand how they work. To be able to better formulate your preservatives. In a nutshell, you take your formulation, you put it in a test tube, and you add a large quantity of specific bacteria of concern to this product. You mix it well, and you let it sit for several days, and then you take samples on specific days. In an ideal case, the preservative in the product will kill some or all of the bacteria over this time frame. And the 5 most commonly tested organisms are these 5 here in the box at the bottom. Candida is a fungus that is normally part of the human microbiome, but it can also cause some pretty nasty infections. Aspergillus is a black mold. E. coli, Pseudomonas, they're both gram-negative bacteria, and Staph aureus is a gram-positive organism. So when you test all 5 of these, you get a very good idea of whether your product is protected against a wide variety of organisms, or just some of them. Obviously, you can test for additional organisms of concern. For example, a specific organism like Burkholderia capacius, often found in your process water at your production site. You will want to test that organism to see if your preservative system can tackle that. And on the right side, you also see that there's different tests. They're all run a similar way, but they have different requirements, and I'll talk about that in a minute. When we measure preservative efficacy, we measure in logs, which is sometimes an odd concept to people that are not working with it on a regular basis. Example, you start with 1 million cells per milliliter and your preservative kills 1 log of organisms, then you get a reduction of 90%, which sounds quite good, but you still have 100,000 cells left. Another example, the disinfectant spray that says kills 99.999% of bacteria, which seems oddly specific, right? The EPA requires a disinfectant to kill 5 logs of organisms, and that's where the 99.999% comes from. So in that case, you would only have about 10 microorganisms left, which is essentially the detection limit. A quick overview of the different passing requirements of different tests. They do not differ that much from one another in terms of how the test is performed, but the requirements are a bit different. Take a look here at the USP 51 criteria. They require 2 or more logs to be killed on day 14, and then no regrowth from there at day 28. For yeast and mold, the requirement is they aren't growing, but no reductions required. In contrast, now look at the European Pharmacopoeia test at the very top. It requires a 2 log reduction at day 2 and a 3 log reduction at day 7. For fungi, it's asking for at least 2 log reduction by day 14. And in comparison, I would say the European test will be quite a bit more difficult to pass, and the USP 51 will be a bit easier to pass. Some companies even come up with their own strict requirements. Your requirements should be based on the type of product you're formulating. For example, for an eye area product, you may want to be a little more conservative than for a food product, as an example. Here's an example of what a challenge test result can look like. Testing labs will often give you a table with log reductions and a pass-fail result, but I personally enjoy this more visual representation. It's quite common that the mold will decrease a little bit slower than the bacteria, but this is still a very good passing result. And this brings me to my conclusion. When you plan your formula, consider your selection criteria to decide on a preservative system. I mentioned pH, cost, naturality, possible incompatibilities, regulations, and so forth. Work with an expert if you do not have one in-house, somebody who can guide you in terms of preservative selection, method selection, troubleshooting if your formula doesn't pass. And don't forget an additional preservative challenge test after your stability period. And most importantly, please help us advocate for the importance of preservatives. It's been a pleasure for me to present to you today, and hopefully you learned something from me. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and enjoy the rest of the eSummit.